Hey folks, so today I'm going to be diving into Alien Colonial Marines Operations Manual. It's the second supplement from Free League's Alien RPG that came out in 2020, and this one was published in 2021. Just like all of Free League's printed books, this one came as a thick hardback with semi-gloss cover. The color motif is almost pure black with the signature white typeset. Out of the now dozens of products I've gotten from Free League, this was the first that came with some damage. They sent this to me as a review copy, so I'm not sweating it, but I'd wager that if you were really upset about shipping damage after purchasing this book, they'd set you straight. The interior has thick pages, and since the book is stitch bound, the pages lay flat on a table. You're actually not going to get a ton of artwork in this book, but the art that is included is the same high caliber stuff that you'll find in the core rulebook and Destroyer of Worlds module. Alright, on to the content itself. Right when you open the book, you're going to get this map that you might be familiar with if you've read the core book. This map actually gets heavily referenced in this book because the book really does drill down and it gives you a lot of detail about most of these locations. Andrew E.C. Gasca wrote this and has been on all of the Alien RPG products. He was the lead writer on the first Alien expansion, Destroyer of Worlds, which comes out as a box set and actually won a few ENnie awards. The thing you need to know about Andrew Gasca, and I mention this because it's relevant to this review, is that he has been given license to guide and shape the Alien canon a bit. A lot of what he does is read what has previously been published, and by the way, he has written a number of official Alien novels, but what he does is gather up what's already been published and synthesize as needed. Anyway, I think my point is that he takes on what I consider a lot of responsibility as the lead writer for these supplements, and he does a really good job. This book runs 360 pages and is essentially two parts. The first part is a detailed explanation of the setting's history, how the U.S. Colonial Marine Corps is organized and operated, character creation, and special gear that your Marine can have. The second half is a discussion of how to put together a Marine-based campaign, a description of some locations and alien races, an explanation of some black projects, and 7 missions that feed an overall story arc, but you can actually use as one-shots as well if you want. I really like this spread of information because it does all the work for you as a GM. It's not just an explanation of setting. 7 missions is a lot of great usable material, and those missions take up almost 150 pages of this book. It's very generous in that regard. So regarding spoilers in this video, I had the choice of revealing all the really great storytelling that Gasca does with the missions and the overall campaign arc that he presents, and thereby actually give you a proper overview of this book. Or my other choice was just to stop at that second half and sort of tease it and avoid the spoilers. In the end, I decided to avoid spoilers so that hopefully your table is able to enjoy the plot twists and surprises intended by the book. But I'll talk a little bit about the arc and give my overall 2 cents. So here in the Alien universe, the U.S. Colonial Marines are part of the United America's Allied Command, quote, tasked with maintaining the collective security of all United American signatories and their recognized interstellar colonies within the frontiers of the network. They coordinate with the Colonial Armed Forces, Colonial Navy, Aerospace Forces, and the Defense Fleet to execute any... The point is, the USCMC is part of a complex military force whose organization and hierarchy largely resembles the United States military of today, which is to say there are a lot of acronyms, a complicated leadership structure, and you're never going to remember all of this unless you're a military buff or an actual service member who has lived some of this stuff. At the end of this page here, it says that Marines sometimes save colonists as heroes and sometimes do paid work for the mega corporation Weyland-Yutani. This is an important theme of the setting, actually, that Weyland-Yutani or some other corporation is pulling the strings behind the scenes, and that scene usually involves extreme danger to human life. The next few pages use that tough guy Marine drill sergeant voice that you've heard a million times in movies, including Aliens. The sergeant here is sort of yelling at you about how much life sucks as a Marine and how on every planet, every plant and animal, large and small, is trying to kill you. Then there are some hints at the setup for the big campaign story arc in the second half of the book. Apparently, colonies are being bombed with black goo that is annihilating them completely, and cleanup crews are having to go in and nuke the destroyed colonies to eradicate a mysterious infection. Okay, on to the history. The chapter headings, by the way, all have these incredible pieces of art, but generally you're not going to see too much art in this book. Okay, so there's this huge timeline. I'm going to give you the bird's eye view of this because frankly, the details, to me at least, were not that compelling. At least not on my first reading and my second pass. Basically, the nations of Earth divided into separate factions. The United Americas, the Three World Empire, the Chinese Asian Nations Cooperative, and later the Union of Progressive Peoples. These are very well described in the core Alien RPG rulebook. I'd say if you want to dig into this timeline properly, go back to the rulebook to page 221 and refresh yourself on these factions. That would really grease the wheels here. Anyway, long story short, these factions all started their own colonies all over the galaxy. Humanity is able to traverse the galaxy through hypersleep travel technology. But eventually there's a bunch of infighting between the factions, and instead of attacking each other's headquarters, they all attack each other's colonies, and it's a huge mess. On top of that, there's mistreatment of colonists that lead to rebellions, as well as the introduction of xenomorphs back in 2122. That's the original Alien movie there. If you're wondering about where the sequel movie Aliens fits in, it's over in 2179. A lot of the timeline is dominated by wars and infighting amongst the colonial factions. The current year is 2184, and the biggest threats are these black goo bombings that are wiping out colonies from existence, and a huge increase in xenomorph and related aliens showing up randomly in colonies. No one knows who is doing the bombings, but two main factions, the United Americas and the Union of Progressive Peoples, are more or less blaming each other. This chapter goes into how the military is organized, and it's a little less painful than the timeline. If you're familiar with the U.S. Marines command structure, or the structure for the U.S. Army for that matter, then this will be all intimately familiar to you. The USCMC is divided into three main Marine space forces. One for the core systems, one for the outer veil and rimward frontier, and one for the outer rim and coreward frontier. Each of these three divisions is broken down into regiments, which have battalions, which in turn have companies, which in turn have platoons. Which actually begs the question of, why is there so much detail about the entire command structure of the Marine Corps here? Just to be complete, I guess. But honestly, there is no intent by the author or game designers for you to ever roleplay at a higher ranking officer, or even really a mid-ranking officer. Anyway, you have your platoon, which is 20 Marines, plus a commanding officer, an adjutant, and 4 dropship personnel. Each platoon is divided into 2 sections run by a platoon commander. This person is usually a lieutenant or captain and has a lower ranked officer or synthetic assist him. Each section has a dropship, an armored personnel carrier, and 2 squads. Each squad is divided into 2 fire teams. A fire team is 2 people. So, okay, a fire team is 2 people, and they can either be a rifle team, which does most anything except heavy guns, or a gun team, which does the heavy guns. There are also recon, assault, or CBRN specialist fire teams. CBRN stands for chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. They are trained in hazmat situations like nuclear fallout, viral outbreaks, and mysterious alien spores that are turning colonists into bloated, disgusting monsters, stuff like that. So I think that all this rank and organization stuff is a little hard to understand at first, and a simple chart would have been really, really useful here. But if you really want to embody your Marine character, it would be nice if you and everyone else at the table sort of has this stuff internalized. The reason being, basic platoon organization is just a known thing among soldiers and Marines. And if you can speak the basic language here and understand how big of a deal it is that your platoon commander just got his head bitten off, then it can add a lot of weight and import to the narrative in the game session. But then again, it would have been nice to have a flowchart here. Here's the deal. There's a lot more going on above your pay grade. Here you have other fleets and forces and military allies floating around with their acronyms, but they aren't nearly as important as knowing the platoon structure. It goes on and on with the organizations, most of which don't have any bearing on a Marine mission. I think at most a GM can use some of these details to generate some official sounding intrigue to set up for a mission, but not much more. Character creation doesn't go too far afield from the core rulebook here. One of the main extra things you get here is your MOS, or military occupational specialty. It's like your military job. In practice, these are just variations on the original Colonial Marine archetype from the core rulebook. There are variations on your key attributes, starting skills, and starting talents. There are 10 of these MOSs, and they offer a bit of variety, although I do think it's incumbent on the player to really lean into the role to make these significant. The field events are for quickly generating some formative backstory events for your character. and they're divided by enlisted, NCO, which is non-commissioned officer, and then pilots and crew chiefs. The book also offers up a handful of new talents, operating all-terrain vehicles in tough terrain, hacking doors, heavy weapons, taking cover from enemy fire, and setting up things like turrets. Speaking of handy charts and tables, this table on the right is pretty handy if you really wanting to embrace the role of a Colonial Marine. The book does make an interesting note here and repeats it again later, and it's that rank apparently doesn't matter in any given group. Everyone is supposed to be enlisted, ranked no higher than a sergeant, and amongst each other, no one is supposed to have authority or rank over another. This makes a lot of sense as a default play policy, but if you really think about it, it removes a lot of the realism of a military-inspired role-playing game. Then again, you don't really want one player bossing other players around and removing their agency at the table. It's a tricky situation, actually, and the book plays it in the right way by making everyone equal regardless. As a player, you get to choose one basic gear, 2 bonus gear, and 1 specialty gear, which coincides with your chosen MOS. The gear section is pretty fun. I appreciated that they really tried to differentiate the weapons. For example, out of the 5 pistols available, 1 is a dart gun that delivers chemicals or toxins, 1 is an armor bypassing electrostatic gun, another has armor piercing. Similarly with the 6 rifles, they all have one kind of specialty gimmick or another. Just for reference, the core book offers an original 4 pistols and 6 rifles, so the total range of small arms in the Alien RPG is pretty sizable with these add-ons. Heavy weapons deliver some serious damage and tend to have even more interesting damage details depending often on the kind of ammunition used. The explosives and ammunition table itself does start to get into the woods a bit with the detail, but I think it's out of necessity. If you get to deliver a ton of area damage in this game, there needs to be some limitations and stipulations. The uniforms and other protective gear almost all offer some mechanical benefit, so it's worth paying close attention to these when you're building your character. There's also body armor and a long list of miscellaneous equipment that can affect rolls. As far as vehicles, there are 2 flavors of APC, one of which is a repeat from the core rulebook. The M577 is the one that you've seen from the movie Aliens, so in a sense it's a classic that bears repeating for this book. The only difference with this new APC is that it has some anti-air missiles mounted on top instead of an energy cannon. They threw a sort of goofy looking tank carrier thing at you. I say goofy, but actually I'm grateful for the illustration. It's nice to have a picture. This Stinger is a fast attack vehicle, but it only seats 2, which is good for splitting up a party or for giving players at the end of a session when there are only 2 survivors left and there's this huge chase or something. If you'll notice, they kept up with putting a price tag on everything, including vehicles. I don't really understand why they do this. The Stinger costs $50,000, for example, but what are the implications of that in the game? As a Marine, you're given your equipment at the start of a mission, and then in the course of action, you appropriate equipment as needed. I'm just not sure where the accounting comes in. On the next couple pages, you get a couple of tanks, a medium and a heavy. I'd be curious to see how tank-to-tank combat would work with the rules of this game. The rules are certainly not optimized for that kind of encounter, so it'd be interesting to see where they break down. A tank on Xenomorph battle would also be fun to run. The airships that you get here are interesting because they lurch into fighter jets, which is something I've never really imagined in the Alien universe. The Alien movies, at least, didn't really dwell on air-to-air or ship-to-ship combat, but you definitely see that element in the Alien RPG, even in the core rulebook, which has rules for large ship-to-ship combat. So again, it would be interesting to see how the rules hold up if you were dogfighting multiple space fighter jets at once, kind of like the tanks. That doesn't feel very Aliens to me, but it could be fun. The book dumps all the vehicle weapons into these tables, which is a little overwhelming. If you're the GM and you want to throw some vehicles at your players to drive around in, you'll need to consult with these tables beforehand and sort out the weaponry. There's a bit of research and bookkeeping to do here. There are 4 new large spacecraft offered in this book, ranging from a smaller skiff to a very large destroyer-class vessel. I touched on it a bit in my review of the core rulebook, but I do think all the spaceship management and operations stuff feels like a separate game from the Alien RPG itself. But I can see why they did it. They wanted to make a fully fleshed out sci-fi RPG that embraces all aspects of the setting and not just focus on fighting Xenos and cramped hallways. I have yet to hear of anyone actually using these big ships in space combat in any of their games, but it's nice to know it's there. Okay, so this whole chapter explains how to structure a Colonial Marines campaign, and it does so through example. In this example, your unit arrives at Orbital Fort, Nebraska at the tail end of the Destroyer of Worlds campaign. By the way, this book's timeline and missions all heavily reference the events from Destroyer of Worlds. It's not to say that you need to read or play Destroyer of Worlds, but as far as where you are in the setting's timeline, the events on the Aryarchus moon colony have happened and you pretty much launch from there. The first part of this chapter really is first and foremost a primer for the 7 missions in the second half of the book. You have some high-ranking NPCs and the huge frigate that you're on, the USS Tambatom. The map artwork in the Alien RPG books is really good and actually recently won an ENnie Award. It's very science fiction-y and appealing to look at, but it's also extremely functional. If you recall, Alien uses zones to define distances rather than a grid. So on this map, you'll see different named rooms or areas of a large room, and they would each be considered different zones for the purpose of movement and weapon areas of effect and the like. You have more NPCs, and then again, the book reminds you to throw all ranks out the window. Then there are some pre-generated Marines for you to grab if you're in a hurry. I actually think it would be a good policy to ask every player to have a backup PC at the start of any session if you're playing this game. Then there's some miscellaneous discussion here about handling combat, nothing out of the ordinary. This section I found really cool. It details 14 different kinds of missions you could create. These different mission archetypes are the first place you should go as a GM if you're trying to create a mission from scratch. Downtime events, I wasn't so sold on. You're supposed to roll up some random event in between major scenes, but these are caught between being a short vignette and being a full-blown interesting scene that needs to be played out. It's pretty gray what you're supposed to do with these. For the most part, this chapter just lays out a bunch of planets that have 1 or 2 environmental gimmicks, but there are a few very notable things in this chapter in terms of moving the needle on the Alien universe, at least if you're like me and you've only watched the movies. These star systems are basically plot seeds for GMs to base a mission on, and I wouldn't say that they aren't compelling. There's just a complete lack of artwork to accompany any of these wildly alien planets. You don't get anything but a snippet of the master map. Then you get to Arcturus, which doesn't have art, but it is very interesting. So here's one of the big things I thought came out of this book, at least in terms of alien canon. On the planet of Arcturus, mankind has found aliens, but they look exactly like us and have identical DNA. Well, it's almost identical DNA. They're called Arcturians, and they have bigger eyes than humans and translucent skin. Their technology is prehistoric, and they worship the engineers and wait for them to return to their planet. In terms of aliens that aren't xenomorphic, there's also a sort of dangerous and violent ape species on the same planet called the Arctura. Kind of confusing, I know, but the craziest thing here is that the Arcturians, which have only ever been mentioned in passing before in novels, and maybe in a movie, are given a complete close-up here. All the other planets detailed in the chapter pale in comparison to this, except there is one planet where they detail some very deadly aggressive plant life I thought was pretty fun. The plants grow inside you and kill you. A lot of what you see with these planets are humans making problems for themselves, which is a great segue to Chapter 8, Black Projects. This is where I have to get sort of cryptic about this book because I don't want to spoil anything. But generally speaking, there are a handful of secret military experiments and operations by different factions here. One of them is a soldier cloning operation that went defunct. Then there's the Berserker Project, where UA scientists tried to create a suit of heavily armed power armor that is controlled by a human who is permanently grafted into the suit. It's actually very dark and grotesque and disturbing, and I'm actually grateful for once in this book that they didn't include any illustrations, or at least internal illustrations. With these berserker suits, the human inside always goes insane or dies in some horrible manner, and the suit is programmed to return to the LZ and spit the body out onto the ground. Just yuck. After this page, it gets into 2 specific black projects that are the basis of the 7 missions at the end of the book. And since I don't want to spoil those, I won't show them. The proper primer and complete overview for the 7 missions is this chapter, and it lays out the whole story arc top to bottom, as it should. But again, that means I can't really show you this chapter either. What I can say is that I've read through this whole campaign and it's really good. You can tell that it's written by someone who knows how to tell an awesome alien story. I guess as a little tease, I'll show you the list of generic NPC stats that reveal the kind of NPCs you'd be facing in these missions. The 7 missions are where the book really shines, I think, and it's ironic that I'm not showing them to you here in this review video. Each mission comes with maps and a lot of details on how to handle the story beats and encounters, and more than anything, each mission has a twist, with a huge twist at the end of the campaign. There are warring human factions, insane cults, xenomorphs, and a new kind of bad alien called the Gore Burster that bloats up their host before exploding out of them. And you go to a Temple of the Engineers at some point. I'm actually glad that I chose to go the non-spoiler route because I could probably discuss these missions for hours, and I think it'd probably be better to just play them. I think in conclusion, regarding these missions, the worst fears that you're left with at the end of the original Alien movies have all but come true. And in the end, only one scrappy platoon of Colonial Marines might be able to stop it. In the end, I think this book could have used more artwork, especially for the Arcturians, the Arctura, and the new xenotypes. But in terms of written content, this book is jam-packed with usable, actionable material for the table. I think the big question a lot of people had when the Alien RPG came out was, does it work without xenomorphs? This book here answers that question. The answer is that Alien RPG needs to have Xenos somewhere in the story, but it doesn't have to be and shouldn't be an alien shootout every scene. Even from the very first movie, humanity's greatest threat was itself in the form of the Weyland-Yutani Corporation. That's a huge theme in the Alien universe, and it's played to its fullest extent with the campaign arc in this book. But don't worry, if you end up playing or running any of these missions, you'll end up with more Xenos than you could ever have wished for. Alright, I'm out. Thanks for watching. See ya.